Our next presenter will be presenting on engaging Indigenous youth in assessing their local food environments, a methodology. So please join me in welcoming Wenis Eliosta, that's her Mohawk name, otherwise known as Brittany Jock.
Sego Sewoguego. Hello, everyone. I wanted to start with a foundation for this work, which is based on some of the concepts from Linda Smith, Tuhiwai Smith, and the idea that decolonized research is transformative because it involves Indigenous people. However, how do we go about operationalizing this in the context of our research? Research has repeatedly shown that diet is improved when traditional foods are consumed. However, First Nations, older populations of the First Nations tend to be eating this, and so we need to figure out for children and understand their perceptions of the food environment. First Nation households report much higher food insecurity compared to the rest of Canada, and of course this relates to higher obesity and diabetes rates. And more than 2/3 of First Nations children, based on previous research, are overweight or obese. So in Canada, there is the Canadian Community Health Survey, which collects nutrition information on the general population. However, this excludes First Nations living on reserve. Previous research has filled this gap for adults, but we're still trying to figure this out for youth, 3 to 19 years old, living on reserve. The Food Environment, Health and Nutrition of First Nations Children and Youth Study, the goal of that is to develop policy and programmatic recommendations and to also build capacity within the participating communities to address nutrition and environmental health issues. And so for this project, we're working to assess the relationships between nutrition and the built social and natural environments on health of First Nations children and youth living on reserve. So for this work, we're working with 60 participating communities, First Nations communities across Canada, and the collaborators for this study include University of Ottawa, McGill, Université de Montréal, and the Université de Laval, as well as the Assembly of First Nations and Health Canada. For this work, there are 4 different components. The first focuses on nutrition and food environment. The second focuses on housing and respiratory health, then environmental contaminants and social determinants of health, and lastly, community mobilization and integrated knowledge translation. And so our community engagement activities are really focusing on that first and fourth component. There are many project approvals as usual, including from the Assembly of First Nations, and we're also working to get local approvals with the communities that we will be working with, including Community Research Agreement, Funding Transfer Agreement, and Band Council Resolution, and using the First Nations OCAP principles. Initial outreach to the communities include presentations to regional chief organizations, invitations to present from the Assembly of First Nations, and presentations to describe the project and answer community questions, and then finally working with the community to get local approvals. After this process and after communities have decided to participate, we'll be doing regional community workshops, regular community presentations to update and ask for feedback, as well as opening, closing celebrations, and using community researchers as a source of community input. First Nations food environments are very complex, as we all know, and include market foods from food stores, traditional food systems, and alternative sources, which include community gardens, farmers markets, and produce gardens, as well as food support like food pantries and food distribution programs. The community engagement aspect of this is really overlapping with the qualitative approaches to understanding the community food environments. And for this, we've planned participatory mapping, especially with children and youth, and complementing that with key informant interviews with experts throughout the community about those food environments. And so for this, we've designed a multi-level mixed methods approach, looking at food access and availability at the community level, food access and utilization at the household level, and looking at a nutritional assessment of 100 randomly selected children in each community. So for the participatory mapping with children aged 6 to 11, we'll be doing separate sessions for each age group, younger and older children. So for children, we'd be doing individual mapping activity followed by discussion and mapping their home and school environment and including that family and extended family as part of that home environment, since that's such an important part of where we gather food. For participatory mapping with youth, we'll be looking collectively about where they and their families get food, especially because as children get older, they have more independence. For key informant interviews, we're really working to understand the local food sources used by children and youth, and doing this again with 12 to 15 participants per community, including traditional food harvesters, social workers, and other experts within the community. And this is happening within the scope of other food environment measures, including the food store access, including price, availability, and quality of items in food stores, child nutrition and health survey, as well as a household environment survey. And that household survey is being done with 100 children in 60 communities across Canada. So FEHNCY will be the first to comprehensively assess for First Nations children and youth the food environment, food security and nutrition, among others, for First Nations children and youth. And so this approach to community engagement will work to mobilize knowledge in locally appropriate ways that recognize community governance and goals for children and youth. So I'm very excited to be here and to present, and Nyawa to the FEHNCY team to let me represent Nyawa.